Good morning, children. Welcome to English class. Children, in our last session, we have discussed lesson 7, the tale of Peter Rabbit. So, here the story is about a little rabbit named Peter. So, once upon a time, there lived 4 little rabbits with their mother. And the names of the 4 little rabbits were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. So, these 4 little rabbits and the mother rabbit lived in a sand bank, that is sand hill, which is underneath the root of a very big fir tree. One day, Mother Rabbit said to the little 4 rabbits that, "Now, my dears, you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." So Mother Rabbit said to the 4 little rabbits that, "Now you can go into the fields or down into the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden, and don't be naughty. Go, and whatever you want you can eat and come back safely." Then Mother Rabbit took the basket and her umbrella and she went into the forest to the baker's shop. Now Flopsy, Mopsy and Cottontail were very good little bunnies. So they went down the lane to gather some blackberries, whereas Peter was very naughty. So as mother warned not to go to Mr. McGregor's garden, Peter was naughty, so Peter straightway ran into Mr. McGregor's garden. Then Peter squeezed under the gate of the garden and entered into the garden. After entering into the garden, Peter ate some lettuce, then some beans, and after that Peter ate some radishes. Then Peter wanted to eat some leafy vegetables, so it is looking around for parsley, for the leafy vegetable. It want to eat the leafy vegetable. So in search of the parsley, it went at the end of the cucumber frame where Mr. McGregor was planting cabbages, the young cabbages. So Mr. McGregor saw Peter. As soon as he saw, he waved a rake and calling out, "Stop thief!" he chased Peter. Now Peter was frightened a lot and rushed all over the garden. As he had forgotten the way back to the gate, he was running all around in the garden. So he lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, the other shoes among the potatoes. So after losing the shoes, now Peter started running on his 4 legs. Then he ran very fastly and finally he entered into the gooseberries. So unfortunately, Peter's coat was struck to the gooseberry's net. The bronze button which was there on the blue jacket stuck to the gooseberry's net. Bronze button which is there to the blue jacket was struck to the gooseberry's net. Peter tried to come out, but it was not possible for him. Now there was no other way. So he left his blue jacket there to the net only, and finally he came out of the gooseberry's net. He cried there as the jacket was new. He liked it very much. He cried and finally he left the jacket to the gooseberry's net and escaped from there. Meanwhile, Mr. McGregor came with a sieve, that is a tool. He planned to catch Peter, but Peter wriggled out and he jumped, leaving his jacket behind him only. He rushed into the tool shed. And after entering into the tool shed, Peter jumped into a can, but the can is filled with water. Next, the place was very good for the Peter to hide if water was not there. Now Mr. McGregor was sure that Peter is hiding somewhere in the tool shed only. So he started turning up the flower pot. He's checking the flower pot and turned all the flower pots very carefully. Meanwhile, Peter shouted, "Critiscoo!" Now he listening to the words of the Peter, Mr. McGregor, he immediately identified from where the sound is coming, from where the noise is coming. So he tried to put his foot upon Peter. As soon as Mr. McGregor is trying to stamp on Peter, Peter jumped out through the window from the stool shed. The window was too small, so it is not possible for the McGregor to come through the window. Now, Mr. McGregor went back to his work as he was tired of running after Peter. Peter jumped out of the window and sat down there only. It took rest as it was out of the breath. It was trembling with fright and fear. It was trembling with fright. So Peter sat down there to take rest and took a long breath. Now, and also Peter was wet as he sat in the water can. Next, after taking rest for a while, Peter he began to wander here and there, looking around in the garden, trying to find the way to go out of the garden. Finally, he found a door in a wall, but the door was locked. There was no other rooms for Peter, so that Peter can go out from there. He tried to find the straight way across. He found a door in a wall, but the door was locked. There was no other room for the rabbit to squeeze underneath it. He tried to find a straight way across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled as he is moving in the garden to find the gate. He was more and more puzzled. At last, he saw a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. There a white cat was looking at the goldfish. He sat there very still, and Peter thought that it is the best way not to speak to the big cat, as he had heard many stories about the cat from his cousin Benjamin Bunny. So Peter now went back to the tool shed only, but suddenly he heard the noise of the hoe, that is scratch, 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 as Mr. McGregor was hoeing the onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was a gate. So Peter ran very fast as he could, and tried to squeeze out of the gate. Mr. McGregor saw Peter at the corner, but Peter did not care him. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the forest outside the garden. This is the story about the tale of Peter Rabbit. Children, now I'll show you the video of the lesson, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Watch the video and understand the lesson clearly, children.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits. Their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree.
"Now, my dears,"
said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning,
"you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Now run along, and don't get into mischief. I'm going out."
Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's shop. Flopsy, Mopsy and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. However, Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuce and some beans. Then he ate some radishes. Then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. Round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out,
"Stop, thief!"
Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, he ran on 4 legs. He might have got away if he had not run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to use to catch Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. He rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Peter sneezed. Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. He tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and had no idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. He came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe.
Scratch, 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 screech.
It was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter started running as fast as he could go, along a straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden.
Okay, that is the video of the story, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. Hope you all enjoyed the story, children. Now, with this, we'll close today's session. Coming to today's your homework, read Lesson 7, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. In tomorrow's session, we will discuss the bits of Lesson 7. Okay, children? Okay, that's it for today. See you in the next session. Bye, children.